I gave a lecture at a college out east not too long ago, and the title of the lecture was, "Does Religion Cause Violence?" And on my way to the lecture hall, I saw a poster for the lecture, and somebody had scrawled the word "duh" over the poster, and I thought, yeah, that pretty much kind of sums it up. So everybody knows, right, this is a kind of common folklore, everybody knows that religion has a dangerous tendency to promote violence. And that is part of the conventional wisdom of Western society. So what I call the myth of religious violence goes something like this. Religion is a transhistorical and transcultural, meaning it's there in human history at all times and places. Human impulse that's essentially distinct from so-called secular ideologies and institutions. Secondly, religion is more prone to promote violence than secular ideologies and institutions. And therefore, religion should be marginalized from public power, and we should fight to defend and spread secular ideals. So in post-9/11 discourse in the US, this story tends to color the way we view the rest of the world. We tell ourselves that we live in a peaceful, secular type of state in which religion has been tamed in the public sphere, while those people over there, Muslims especially, right, still mix religion with politics, and that makes their politics peculiarly volatile and dangerous, right? So their violence is religious, and therefore it's irrational and divisive. Our violence, on the other hand, is secular and rational and peacemaking, and therefore, you know, we find ourselves regrettably forced to bomb them into the higher rationality, right? So this evening I'm going to challenge that conventional story, and I'm going to argue that there is no essential difference between so-called religious and secular ideas and practices. So there's no good reason for thinking that so-called religious ideas and practices are more inherently prone to violence than secular ideas and practices. And thirdly, then, the idea that something called religion is essentially prone to violence is an ideological justification that can be used to justify the violence of so-called secular orders. Now, if all that sounds complicated, let me put the thesis in simpler terms. People kill for all sorts of things. That's it. People kill for all sorts of things. People are just as likely to kill for their country than for a god, maybe more so. And the reason is that the nation state, in some contexts, has taken the place of God. So American Christians, for example, are far more likely to kill on behalf of the state than on behalf of Jesus. Now, let me be clear that I don't at all deny that Christians and Muslims and others can and do use their faith to justify violence. So I'm not arguing, for example, that you hear sometimes that violence of these sorts of people is really political and not really religious. What I deny is that Muslims or Christians or Buddhists, their violence is of an essentially different and inherently more troublesome nature than violence in the name of supposedly more mundane and secular realities like kings or nations or flags or freedom or oil. And the idea that there is something called religion that is more troublesome can and is used to promote violence on behalf of secular nation states like our own. Okay, so I'm going to start then with the idea that there's this essential difference between religion and the secular. The famous atheist Christopher Hitchens' best-selling book, God is Not Great, which is subtitled with typical British understatement, How Religion Poisons Everything, right? In that book, he points to histories of abuses by Christians and Jews and Muslims and Hindus and Confucianists and Buddhists and so on. But at some point in the book, he also faces up to the fact that atheist regimes, like those of Joseph Stalin and Kim Jong-il, are responsible for tens of millions of deaths and uncounted suffering. And so Hitchens deals with this problem by declaring that atheist regimes like Stalin's are religious too. He says totalitarianism aims at human perfection, which is essentially a religious impulse, according to Hitchens. So basically, religion poisons everything because everything poisonous gets labeled as religious, right? At the same time, everything good ends up on the other side of the religious-secular divide. Here's what Hitchens says about Martin Luther King. In no real as opposed to nominal sense, then, was he a Christian. And he bases this remarkable claim on the notion that King was nonviolent, and so therefore he couldn't possibly be religious. So what's not violent can't possibly be religious because religion is defined as violent. Now, at this point, we could just dismiss Hitchens as being peculiarly confused, and we could assume that, of course, everybody knows Stalin is not really religious, he's an atheist. And we could start arguing over who caused more deaths in the 20th century, atheists or people that believe in God and so on. But that would be to assume that we really know what religion is and what religion is not. Hitchens is useful because he shows that what counts as religion and what doesn't is very fluid and often depends on the political agenda that one is pursuing. So Hitchens is by no means alone in this. If you examine arguments that religion causes violence, you find that what counts as religion and what doesn't is largely incoherent. So let me And that, I think, is particularly relevant to the question of violence. Right? Is there any good reason to suppose that people are more likely to kill for a god than for a nation? Right? You look out at the world and you say, some places yes, but in some places no, right? Take our own context, right? What if we ask two questions? What percentage of Americans who identify themselves as Christians would be willing to kill for their Christian faith or kill for Jesus? Not many, right? If you ask, on the other hand, what percentage would be willing to kill for their country, it seems clear that, at least among American Christians, right, the nation-state is subject to far more absolutist fervor than Christianity. Most Christians would assume that under certain circumstances, it's your duty to kill for your country, right? The majority of American Christians consider public evangelization to be in poor taste, right? We hate it when somebody, when a Jehovah's Witness comes knocking at the door, right? You pretend you're not home, right? But most endorse organized slaughter on behalf of the nation as sometimes necessary and often laudable, right? And I think we need to conclude then that there's no coherent way to isolate religious ideologies with a peculiar tendency toward violence from their tamer secular counterparts. So-called secular ideologies and institutions like nationalism and capitalism can inspire just as much violence as so-called religion. Now, let me entertain another objection that maybe is going through your mind, right? This sounds like hair-splitting over definitions. But it's really nothing more complicated than what the Bible says about idolatry, right? What I'm saying here is not new. It's in your Bibles from cover to cover. The condemnation of idolatry, the basic idea in the Bible that people worship all kinds of things, right? They treat all kinds of things as gods. Golden calves, armies, mammon, even their own bellies, as Paul says to the Philippians 3:19. Their gods are their bellies, right? The Bible, of course, teaches that there is one true God among the many false gods, but the Bible doesn't think there is one set of religious pursuits and another essentially different set of mundane or secular pursuits, right? That's why the Old Testament goes into so much detail about what to do with your birds' nests and your pots and pans, and what to do when a donkey falls into a pit, and what to do with water into which a dead weasel has fallen, and things like that, right? Because all of your mundane things it's not a separate religious life, right? People in actual fact treat all kinds of things as gods, and so-called religious and so-called secular ideas and practices often function in the same way. And that, I think, is just a basic biblical insight. So the problem with Hitchens, then, is not just that he thinks Stalinism is a religion. The problem is that if he's going to use this expanded definition of religion, he should do so consistently, but he doesn't. For Hitchens, American civil religion is not religion. Only Soviet civil religion is, right? American civil religion for Hitchens is purely secular. So the religious secular distinction is really nothing more than the distinction between things Hitchens likes and things Hitchens doesn't like, right? And the problem, again, is not that the concept of religion has fuzzy edges. I'll get this objection sometimes. Yeah, sure, the concept of religion has fuzzy edges. So does every concept. Culture, right? Politics, right? The problem is not that the concept of religion has fuzzy edges. The problem is that as it's used by these religion and violence theorists, the distinction between religious and secular is unjustifiably clear. It's exactly the opposite from the problem of the edges being too fuzzy. So certain belief systems like Islam are condemned, while certain others like nationalism are ignored. So my point here is not to argue either for or against this expanded functionalist definition of religion. I have no intention of trying to solve once and for all the debate between functionalists and substantivists, whether or not Confucianism or Marxism or free market ideologies are religions, for example, because I don't think there is a once and for all definition of religion. My point is that religion is a category which is constructed in different ways in different times and places, and according to the interests of those who are doing the construction. To understand why there's so much confusion around the category of religion, we need to do some history. So that's the next thing that I'm going to do, the history of the term. So Charles Kimball's book, When Religion Becomes Evil, begins with the following claim. It is somewhat trite, but nevertheless sadly true, to say that more wars have been waged, more people killed, and these days more evil perpetrated in the name of religion than by any other institutional force in human history. End quote. Kimball doesn't give any evidence for this, but if he were to try to prove it, he would need a transhistorical and transcultural concept of religion that would be at least theoretically separable from other institutional forces over the course of history. So political institutions, for example, right? The problem is that there was no religion considered as something separable from politics until the modern era, and then in the modern West. Right? The religion-politics distinction is a modern Western invention. The Romans had a term, religio, that we get our term religion from, but it didn't mean anything like what we mean by religion. There is no religion-politics distinction. How could there be when Caesar is a god? Right? Did the Aztecs kill people? Were there bloody human sacrifices because of religion or because of politics? Well, the question doesn't make sense in the Aztec context. There is no distinction between religion and politics in the Aztec context. As Wilfred Cantwell Smith showed in his landmark 1962 book, The Meaning and End of Religion, religion as a discrete category separable from culture, politics, etc., is an invention of the modern West. He goes back and he does a historical study, a detailed historical study, of the concept of religion. And he concludes that in pre-modern Europe, there was no significant concept equivalent to what we think of as religion. Right? The ancient Romans had this term religio, but it covered all kinds of civic duties and relations of respect that we would consider to be secular. So here's what Augustine says in the beginning of the 5th century. We have no right to affirm with confidence that religio is confined to the worship of God, since it seems that this word has been detached from its normal meaning, in which it refers to an attitude of respect in relations between a man and his neighbor. That's not at all what we mean by the term religion, right? There's no religious secular distinction going on here. In the medieval era, the religious secular distinction was a distinction between two kinds of Catholic priests, right? It didn't at all mean what we mean by it. The religious were those who belonged to an order, and the secular were those who belonged to a diocese, right? Catholics still talk about joining an order as joining the religious life, right? In the year 1400, according to the Oxford English Dictionary, the religions of England were the various orders, the Benedictines, the Dominicans, the Franciscans, and so on. There was no realm of secular pursuits to which God was indifferent. And though there was a distinction between civil and ecclesiastical authorities, there was no distinction between religion and politics as we conceive it. So this distinction, this religious secular distinction as we know it today, was a creation of the early modern period. And it was a creation of struggles between the church and civil authorities. In the creation of the modern sovereign state between the 15th and the 17th centuries, I have a detailed history of this in the book, but I'm just going to do it in a couple sentences here. Religion was invented as a universal, essentially interior and private impulse that was essentially separate from politics and other so-called secular concerns. So henceforth, the church's proper area of concern would be essentially alien from politics, right? So in other words, you take all that the church is concerned with and you put it into this box called religion, which is something private, and that then allows the civil authorities to have free reign in the so-called public realm, right? Another modern distinction, public and private. The idea that religion is a transcultural and transhistorical impulse then is false, and it makes this separation of religion and politics appear natural and inevitable, but it's really just a contingent arrangement of power in society. So it takes place in Europe first between the 15th and the 17th centuries, and then it gets exported to the rest of the world in the process of colonization. So Smith's study concludes, quote, "There is no closely equivalent concept to religion in any culture that has not been influenced by the modern West," end quote. He goes looking for the concept of religion in ancient Greece, in Egypt, China, India, and he finds it nowhere in the ancient world. And in their initial encounters with the non-Western world, it's remarkable. European explorers go out and they report back with remarkable consistency that the natives have no religion at all. I've got a long list of these instances of explorers reporting back home that the natives have no religion. Once they're colonized, though, then suddenly we discover that they have religions after all. Religion becomes a powerful tool for categorizing the local cultures. How does this work? Let me give you one example. Hinduism, for example. Hinduism, which is a word that first appears in the 1780s. You've got Hindus before then, but we don't have Hinduism. Hinduism becomes a religion in the 19th century as it's being colonized by the British, right? Hinduism becomes a religion despite the fact that Hinduism encompasses everything it means to be Indian, right? Everything that we divide into culture and politics and religion and economy and so on. There's one scholar, Fritz Stahl, who says, quote, "Hinduism does not merely fail to be a religion, it's not even a meaningful unit of discourse," end quote. Now, this is not an insult to Hindus. What he's saying is that it's so big, it's the whole of Indian culture. It's like talking about Americanism, right? What does that mean? Well, it can mean a zillion different things, right? The classification of Hinduism, this big thing, into this little thing called religion, though, proves remarkably useful for the British. Because basically, if under British rule, Hinduism a religion, then to be Indian is to be private, and to be British is to be public, right? And that's a very short version of how this works, much more detail in the book. But this is why many contemporary, as in right now, advocates of Hindu nationalism refuse to call Hinduism a religion. So the powerful BJP, I think the ruling party in India right now, they reject the classification of Hinduism as a religion. Richard Cohen writes, quote, "The proponents of Hindutva, Hindu nationalism, refuse to call Hinduism a religion precisely because they want to emphasize that Hinduism is more than mere internalized beliefs. It's social, political, economic, familial in nature." And this struggle goes on all around the world. Similar reasons, Chinese nationalists at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th centuries refused to categorize Confucianism and Taoism as religions, right? The Chinese government today, they have a document 19. It's the official list of the 5 religions in China, and Confucianism is not one of them. Why? Because they say it's superior to religion. It's part of the national character. It's not a religion. Religion is private and otherworldly. So in her book, The Invention of World Religions, that title should say a lot, The Invention of World Religions, Tomoko Masusawa says, "This concept of religion as a general transcultural phenomenon, yet also as a distinct sphere in its own right, is patently groundless." It came from nowhere, and there is no credible way of demonstrating its factual and empirical substantiality. Now, the only thing I think that she gets wrong there is that it didn't come from nowhere. It came from the West in the process of colonization. So in other words, the religious-secular distinction is not engraved in the nature of things. It's a distinction that is employed by Western or Westernized societies to marginalize certain kinds of things, beliefs and practices, and to authorize other kinds of beliefs and practices. In foreign policy, the conventional wisdom, you hear it all the time these days, right? All the news about ISIS and so on. The conventional wisdom helps reinforce and justify Western attitudes and policies toward the non-Western world, especially the Muslims, right? Those crazy Muslims over there. They're different from us because they stubbornly refuse to tame religious passions in the public sphere. And so Hitchens, for example, he skewers religion for its violence, but he was an enthusiastic supporter of the Iraq War and Western military adventures in the Muslim world. Despite his attempt to recruit Martin Luther King to his side, Hitchens had some very approving things to say about killing people. Here's a quote from Hitchens, "And I say to the Christians while I'm at it, go love your own enemies, by the way, don't be loving mine. I think the enemies of civilization should be beaten and killed and defeated, and I don't make any apology for it." End quote. For Hitchens, the Iraq War was part of a broader war for secularism, and for him, the game is zero-sum. Quote, "It's not possible for me to say, well, you pursue your Shiite dream of a hidden imam, and I pursue my study of Thomas Paine and George Orwell, and the world is big enough for both of us. The true believer cannot rest until the whole world bows the knee." End quote. Now, the true believer he has in mind, of course, is the Muslim. But Hitchens' message is that the true believer in secularism can also not rest until the whole world has been converted to secularism, by force if necessary. One more example. Fellow new atheist Sam Harris, very famous author. He has a book about violence and irrationality of religion, and it dramatically illustrates this double standard. It's called The End of Faith. Harris, in the beginning of the book, condemns the irrational religious torture of witches, but he provides his own argument later in the book for torturing terrorists. And his book is charged with the conviction that the secular West cannot reason with religious people, but must deal with them by force. Here's what he says. "Some propositions are so dangerous that it may even be ethical to kill people for believing them. Certain beliefs place their adherents beyond the reach of every peaceful means of persuasion, while inspiring them to commit acts of extraordinary violence against others. There is, in fact, no talking to some people," religious people. "If they cannot be captured, and they often cannot, otherwise tolerant people may be justified in killing them in self-defense. This is what the United States attempted in Afghanistan and what we and other Western powers are bound to attempt at an even greater cost to ourselves and innocents abroad, elsewhere in the Muslim world. We will continue to spill blood in what is, at bottom, a war of ideas." Now, his logic here is impeccable, right? If religious people hold these crazy beliefs so fervently that they will do violence for them, then there's no use trying to reason with them. They can only be dealt with by force. So the myth of religious violence becomes a justification for the use of violence. In a chapter entitled "The Problem with Islam," Harris writes, "In our dialogue with the Muslim world, we are confronted by people who hold beliefs for which there is no rational justification, and which therefore cannot even be discussed." You can't even talk to Muslims, right? "And yet these are the very beliefs that underlie many of the demands they are likely to make upon us," end quote. And this is especially a problem, he says, if such people gain access to nuclear weapons. There's little possibility of our having a Cold War with an Islamist regime armed with long-range nuclear weapons. In such a situation, the only thing likely to ensure our survival may be a nuclear first strike of our own. Needless to say, this would be an unthinkable crime, as it would kill tens of millions of innocent civilians in a single day. But it may be the only course of action available to us, given what Islamists believe. He goes on to say that Muslims would then likely misinterpret this act of self-defense as a genocidal crusade. I swear I'm not making this up. Thus plunging the world into nuclear holocaust. And so he says all of this is perfectly insane, of course. I have just described a plausible scenario in which much of the world's population could be annihilated on account of religious ideas that belong on the same shelf with Batman, the Philosopher's Stone, and unicorns, right? So in other words, if we have to slaughter millions of people through a nuclear first strike, it's their fault and their crazy religious beliefs. Before we get to that point, though, Harris says, we must encourage civil society in Islamic countries, but of course we can't trust them to vote it in. And so he says, one more quote from Harris, it seems all but certain that some form of benign dictatorship will generally be necessary to bridge the gap. But benignity is the key, and if it cannot emerge from within a state, it must be imposed from without. The means of such imposition are necessarily crude: economic isolation, military intervention, etc. While this may seem an exceedingly arrogant doctrine to espouse, I think it appears we have no alternatives, right? Now, Harris's book is a particularly blunt version of this type of justification for violence, but he's by no means isolated. Now, to conclude then, I don't wish either to deny the virtues of liberalism or secular democracy, or to excuse the vices of other kinds of social orders. What I'm trying to do is level the playing field. Okay, what I'm trying to do is level the playing field. Leveling the playing field doesn't mean that the game's going to end in a tie. It just means that all the fouls are going to be called fairly, right? Leveling the playing field means that we can examine the violence, and we should examine the violence that can be generated and is generated by the concept of jihad, for example. But we should also examine the violence that can be generated by ideologies of free markets and free elections. So put simply, my argument is that people kill for all sorts of things. Things like money and flags and oil and freedom that function as gods in people's lives. So I want to challenge the religious-secular dichotomy that causes us to turn a blind eye to liberal forms of imperialism and violence. Insofar as the myth of religious violence creates the villains against which our social order defines itself, it's little different from previous forms of Western imperialism in which those people over there need to be made by force if necessary to be more like us. If the argument is taken seriously, I think it would neither vilify Western-style liberalism nor justify theocracy, but help us see that those are not the only two choices there are. We don't have to choose between Iran and Canada, right? There are all sorts of other options out there. Violence feeds on the need for enemies, the need to separate us from them. And such binary ways of dividing the world make the world understandable for us, but unlivable for many. So doing away with the myth of religious violence is one way of resisting such binaries and perhaps turning some enemies into friends. Thank you.